Hello and welcome to the third video, all about my sketches of the properties on the London Monopoly Board. Now in this third set we're going to look at the pinks, okay? So that's Pall Mall, Whitehall and Northumberland Avenue. Now all three of these are geographically linked, just like the light blue set were, except that each of the pinks radiates away from Trafalgar Square, although Trafalgar Square itself is not one of them. That's far too exclusive. Whitehall's a major thoroughfare, Pall Mall and Northumberland Avenue less so. Okay, aren't word derivations fascinating? Now, if your answer is no, or not really, you might want to fast forward through the next minute or two. So, Pall Mall. Pall Mall takes its name from an Italian game, Palamaglio. P-A-L-L-A-M-A-G-L-I-O. The game was in some ways similar to croquet because it involved hitting balls with mallets. The literal translation of the Italian is ball mallet, and it's clear to see how the Italian name mutated into the English Pall Mall. Charles II was very fond of the game, which was played on a long, narrow rink. And he had Pall Mall laid out so that he could stroll over from the nearby Palace of Whitehall for a leisurely game. Samuel Pepys mentions it in his diary where he calls the game pell-mell. Well, nowadays if you do something pell-mell you do it in a rushed and disorderly fashion, which somehow doesn't sound very like croquet to me. Pall Mall was eventually developed with commercial properties and gentlemen's clubs. As for the name, the word mall thus became applied, or mall I should say, thus became applied to many long straight roads containing shops and commercial premises. From there, it's only a small hop to applying the word mall or mall to a building containing shops and outlets. When I was a kid, I used to think that Pall Mall and the mall, or the mall, were all the same place. But no, the mall is a long, wide road leading from Trafalgar Square to Buckingham Palace, and the idea of developing it with buildings or hotels is pretty unthinkable. Maybe the fact that Pall Mall was home to some of London's most famous and exclusive gentlemen's clubs appealed to Victor Watson. Then again, maybe he was influenced by the fact that Pall Mall was, and is, the name of a well-known brand of cigarette. It's surprising how many properties on a London Monopoly board are or have been the names of cigarette brand. Just going off the top of my head, there's Pall Mall, Strand, Piccadilly, Bond Street, Park Lane and Mayfair. They've all been cigarette brands at one time or another. Not to mention the most surprising of all, which I'm not actually going to mention until we get there. So our second pink property is Whitehall. And this is a thoroughfare connecting Trafalgar Square to the Houses of Parliament. And the road itself goes onwards to Westminster Bridge, although it's not called Whitehall when it does that. The thoroughfare passes through some of the area which was formerly occupied by the Royal Palace of Whitehall, hence the name. And this was a monarch's principal residence within what we now think of as London, from the reign of Henry VIII until it burned down in 1698. It was called the Whitehall because of the stone from which it was originally built, shades of Whitechapel. Whitehall Palace burned down in 1698 with only the banqueting hall by Inigo Jones surviving. Nowadays, Whitehall is a term which doesn't just apply to the street. Whitehall Palace was the centre of government administration from Henry VIII's time, and this continued even after the palace burned down, since many government ministry headquarters were sited along Whitehall. Some still are. So the word Whitehall can also refer to government policy and to the civil service who administer it. Coming back to the thoroughfare, there's lots of notable things associated with it, as well as the ministry buildings. Whitehall is where the cenotaph stands. And cenotaph literally translates as empty tomb. And it's where the Remembrance Day ceremony takes place. The entrance to Horse Guards Parade, which is on Whitehall, is always flanked by ceremonially dressed members of the Household Cavalry. Downing Street, home of the UK Prime Minister, can be accessed from Whitehall. but only if you have the correct pass. Just off Whitehall, linking it with Northumberland Avenue, which we'll come to later, is a street called Great Scotland Yard, where the original headquarters of the Metropolitan Police Force were located. Whitehall itself also is punctuated with half a dozen statues and memorials, most of which commemorate figures from the history of the British Armed Forces. I was given recently a packet of different coloured fine liners, 10 in all, and I used the brown for this one, although when I scanned the picture it looked more black than brown. The Pinkset's Boss location, Northumberland Avenue, is a relatively short thoroughfare which links Trafalgar Square with the Embankment. It's one of the youngest streets on the London Monopoly Board. Pall Mall was laid out in the 1660s. Whitehall was laid out following the burning down of the Whitehall Palace right at the end of the 17th century. But Northumberland Avenue was built between 1874 and 1876 on the site of the former Northumberland House, the London home of the Percy family, the Dukes of Northumberland. Whenever I've been there, it's always struck me as a continental-style avenue. And this is partly because, although it's short, it's also really wide. And there's a reason for this. The developers used the width of the street to get around local building and planning regulations, which stipulated that hotels mustn't be built taller than the width of the road they were on. Notable amongst these hotels was a Hotel Metropole, which still exists under another name. Prince Albert Edward, the future King Edward VII, was very fond of it, and the building's notable for its striking wedge-shaped. Another interesting building is a preserved cabman's shelter. Laws in London in the 19th century stipulated that horse-drawn cab drivers could not leave their cab while it was on a cab stand. The Cab Shelter Fund, which still exists to maintain the shelters, was established to build shelters for cabmen so that they could get a hot meal without risking their cabs being stolen, and also without risking freezing to death in the depths of winter. At one time, these distinctive little green buildings were a fairly common sight in London. There were more than 60 of them. There was one in Ealing Broadway when I was growing up in the 70s. That's gone, but it's been replaced by a new structure which is obviously inspired by the traditional cabman's shelter. There's only 13 remaining now, but each one is a listed building. Now, as I mentioned, I was given a pack of Staedtler fine liners with nibs 0.3 millimeters thick. These are as thick as I'd ever want to use for this kind of sketch. I wouldn't want to use anything thicker, but I did want to try them out. I really like this green I used for Northumberland Avenue. Now, in the next video, we'll be moving on to the oranges, okay? And in particular, you'll see a sketch where the colour really didn't come off. So, hope to see you then.